I
No,
think
no,
Putin is trying to do something with Donald Trump, which doesn't influence Donald Trump's position in the United States. He doesn't want to weaken Donald Trump
sure,
because he sees Donald Trump himself as a different voice from the establishment.
absolutely. I mean, he does. I mean, I don't think it really matters. I don't think Donald Trump actually decides that much, right? Personally, I believe that the institutions do, right? That even with his own administration, he's got people just like he did during his first administration, whose primary goal is to manipulate him, right? To present him with limited policy options that then he has to choose among, and so forth. That it was admitted by John Bolton how easy it was to manipulate Trump during the first administration. There you've got people, everyone's doing it. Trump invites people to manipulate him, right? Trump doesn't read anything. He's an idiot, right? He has it president has to be short and snappy with lots of pictures when you're presenting him with policy options, right? That's the way he likes it. That's what he demands. Um, he's not an educated context kind of guy, right? That's not the way he works. So he's got people with his own administration that do it. People within the deep state, be the intelligence services, the security services, everyone. And so I don't think that he really is allowed. Putin has commented on this before that every once in a while, a U.S. president comes in and thinks they're going to do something differently, and then he says the people in black suits show up and explain to them the way the world works, right? And that's where they are with Trump. But Trump, he kind of he thinks of himself like a king or the god emperor of mankind, if you will. And everyone, right, domestically, other leaders around the world, they're supposed to come to his court
Yeah.
and pay court to him, right? That's the way, right? So the
That
game is flattery, appealing to his narcissism, giving him this, giving him that, never
kiss,
disagreeing with him on
kiss
everything, right?
something.
Yeah, I mean, and Putin does this. Now, because Trump regards Putin, seriously, right? I think he honestly idolizes Putin a bit, right? But that's delving into psychoanalysis, so maybe that's beyond the scope of foreign policy analysis. But regardless, he Putin is a bit better at it, at manipulating Trump, but still he's doing it from the outside, from the adversary, if you will. So it has very limited effect. And yes, quite obviously, Putin is still hoping against hope that he can get Trump to, ultimately walk away. That would be the best thing. For Russia to just wash his hands of this whole thing. And, he plays up the divisions. Putin talks about, oh, how rigged the U.S. elections were, something like, he knows how to play Trump, right? He's former intelligence. He has a psychological profile of Trump that I'm sure is constantly updated, right? He knows, he's kind of the anti-Trump in that regard. He comes to every meeting with every leader very well prepared, right? Knows how to push all their buttons, the things to say, all of this. Putin's a master at it, right?
Okay.
So that said, as soon as they got him out of the room with Putin, then it was back into the indoctrination, of the U.S. establishment and the people in his own administration. So, whatever understanding, right, or brief moment of camaraderie that they had in person at Anchorage, something that Trump obviously wanted, desperately. Ultimately, the effects of it, I agree with Ryabkov. It's a dead end, right? It's not going anywhere. If Putin wants to hope against hope, that's fine. I made it clear I don't do hope. Hope is the death of analysis. I think it's dead, and I don't think Trump ultimately has the power to reverse U.S. course to the degree that would be necessary for the U.S. to walk away, right? To play this sleight of hand where U.S. weapons that such as they can still provide go to Ukraine, only the Europeans pay for it, and it goes through them, right? Ultimately, that doesn't matter so much to the Russians, right? Because it doesn't matter where the money ultimately comes from that are killing Russians. If the quantity stays the same, if the quantity of weapons changes, less, well, then that's another story. But Putin is playing the game, and when he's playing a diplomatic game, of course, it's not only about U.S.-Russia relations, because Putin has to manage his relations with the rest of the world, in particular the other BRICS leaders, right? Lula, Modi, and the others, right? They don't need to worry so much about China. They know China's on side, but Indonesia, all of these other leaders that continue to trade with Russia, even increasing trade with Russia, everything, in part because they believe that Russia is being reasonable, that Russia is playing the game from diplomatic moral high ground, right, compared to certainly the Trump administration, right? And so there are multiple things that Putin is factoring in. You could make the argument that Putin may not even believe that anything will come of this game, right? Still continuing to engage with the United States, but might still be going through it for other diplomatic reasons that have little to do with direct U.S.-Russia relations, right? And the possibility of any success there. That's possible, right? But again, that's kind of moot, because as analysts, right, and journalists, we're allowed to talk through that stuff. We don't have to play those games. So I don't see it leading anywhere. But we should be aware that there was some domestic and elite disgruntlement against Putin's perceived response to Trump's possible escalation, right? That saying that it would ruin U.S.-Russian relations when they're already in the toilet wasn't a substantial deterrent red line, statement. But that it is not a coup, right? We're nowhere, that's not even possible. It's not with it. It's in the realm of fantasy stuff and personal projection, I guess, or something. I don't even know. But that brings us to where we are now with the situation, and everything that is being printed in the media makes it sound like it's a done deal, that the Tomahawks are going to be transferred, right? That's the way the Telegram is talking about it, as pressure, blah, blah, blah. But again, there's no real specifics about how they would actually fire. There's some possibility that they could jury rig a lighter ground-based launcher, much smaller and more manageable than the Typhoon. But if so, they would still be doing it, apparently on the fly. And the U.S. isn't very good at that. The U.S. military-industrial complex is not very good at that. And if they did, it's likely that it wouldn't be in enough quantities that Russia would even, in the scope of this titanic war of attrition, Russia would barely notice, other than politically. So that's why it's a big issue, but it's not a big issue also at the same time.
Mark, you mentioned Donald Trump. He really wanted to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was, and finally someone from Venezuela got the peace, the award. And do you see the situation in Venezuela somehow related to what's going on? I'm talking about the end game with Russia, because
it's not an end game with Russia, right? We're in the end game, right? We are in World War III, right?
Exactly.
We are in a series of conflicts, a conflict for world order that encompasses multiple areas, multi-spheres, and absolutely, there is someone of a high position in the deep state, in the blob, if you will, in Langley or the Pentagon or both. There's someone looking at a map of the world, right? Like they're looking at a Civ 6 map or something like that, or a chess map, right? And saying, oh, you're trying to take our knight in Ukraine, our Kiev regime proxy away from us. Well, boom, we're going to take Syria away from you. And now we're going to take Venezuela away from you too, right? This is what's going on. At some level, that's the decision being made. Now, there's lots of other things to consider, like, Venezuela having the largest proven oil reserves in the world and it being in the Western hemisphere, not very
And
far.
that's the key. That's the key, Mark, I think. The Venezuelan oil is the key, because the United States, Scott Bessent, just 2 days ago, he reiterated the same sort of mindset on the part of the Trump administration that China and India should stop buying Russian oil. They have to buy American oil. But it's not, after all, that's, for the case of India, at least, that's not affordable for India to go after the
Sure.
United States, buy it from the United States. How can they make it affordable for India? Would be an option in a long run. Venezuela, the case of Venezuela, that they
And
can influence the market. Yeah.
the Indian government even said that to a couple of weeks ago to the United States. Look, if you want us to stop to buy less Russian oil, then you've got to let us buy Iranian oil or Venezuelan oil. They outright said that. Now, they weren't serious about it, but the U.S. is deadly serious about it, of course. The Indians are very angry about the U.S. Removing the waiver to sanctions on the Chahabad port in Iran. That Iran has, India has invested a huge amount of money in Iran, because India, has previously also gotten large amounts of energy from Iran, and they've invested so much there. This is seen as another U.S. attack on their sovereignty, on their foreign policy. So, there's multiple levers that this goes into. Also, Europe is dying now because of a shortage of energy. And then all the super expensive U.S. LNG shipments in the world can't make up for what they've lost. But if suddenly they were getting shipped Venezuelan energy, that would really help them, right? That would really help. So there are multiple levels to doing this, for a reason for doing this. Another reason is the Venezuelan government is weak. Like, if Trump is looking for a win, right? They have very limited options against Russia. They tried a quick decapitation strike regime change against Iran, and Iran proved a lot more tough and a lot more capable of hitting back at Iran, exhausting U.S. and Israeli their Achilles heel, their limited air defense interceptor supplies, pretty formally. And if we're talking about the potential for another U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran, which there's some indications that they're considering and even building up forces, the same problem is still there. The U.S. doesn't have enough air defense interceptors to defend Israel, much less the Israel plus all the U.S. military bases in the Middle East, plus give some to Ukraine and Taiwan and pivot to China and all of this. It just doesn't make enough, and they have not been able to ramp up. The Pentagon has ordered, right, the U.S. military industrial complex to double or quadruple production of some 12 missiles, right? And one of those is certainly the Patriot, the PAC-3 interceptor. And the response from industry was like, yeah, that's not really possible unless you want to invest tens of billions of dollars, that would allow us to buy up the facilities and train up the labor and acquire the downstream material supplies and everything that would be necessary to do that. So this is a very limiting option for the United States. But in Venezuela has very limited air defense. Now, they do have some older Russian S-300s, is my understanding, but not a lot of them. They don't have a significant air force, right? They don't and they have a significant domestic opposition that is, the Western media is openly talking about the U.S. getting the opposition ready, right, when they launch their decapitation strikes and regime change to take over on the ground, right? And that is quite obviously what has happened with this Nobel imperialism prize. I'm sorry, peace prize. My bad. It's just a big green light, right? We're not going to give you the Nobel Peace Prize this time, Trump, but we are going to greenlight your regime change of Venezuela because ultimately that would really help our energy situation in Europe too, right? I mean, that's flat out what they said.